Have you ever wondered what would happen if, during a peaceful night, you were left alone with a child and something macabre began to manifest itself? These real horror stories involving babysitters will leave you breathless. Stories of nights where fear took over and the supernatural appeared where you least expected it. Stay with us and discover the dark secrets that these babysitters faced, because what they went through, no one could have predicted. Get ready, because the terror begins now. I accepted the babysitting job in that old house without hesitation. The pay was good, and the parents seemed kind, but I had already experienced something sinister there, and only now do I realize that I should have refused. The first night, everything seemed normal. The parents left at 10 p.m., leaving simple instructions. To put Miguel to bed at 10:30 p.m., it takes him a while to fall asleep, but he'll be asleep soon, they said. I went upstairs, feeling the weight of the silence in that house. Miguel's room was decorated in soft tones, but something about it bothered me. The furniture seemed out of place, as if it had been rearranged in a hurry. An old rocking chair in the corner caught my eye, and I swear I saw it move slightly, but I blamed it on the draft. Miguel was sitting up in bed, his feet dangling in the air. His eyes were big, too dark for a child that age. He smiled strangely and asked, "You're gonna stay here all night, right?" "Yes, until your parents get back," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Do they always come back?" He replied in an innocent tone, but it made me shiver. I tried to ignore the discomfort and put him to bed. But as the hours passed, I noticed something strange. Miguel wasn't sleeping. He just stayed there, motionless, staring at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell slowly, but there was not even a blink of an eye. The house seemed to take on a life of its own. The clock on the wall read 3:17 when a low noise sounded in the hallway. A shuffling of feet. My muscles tensed. I looked at the half-open door and saw a shadow. Small, motionless. I turned to Miguel, but he was no longer in bed. What happened next made my heart almost stop. A soft laugh filled the room, coming from the armchair. Miguel was sitting there, but his eyes were no longer the same. My body froze. Miguel was sitting in the rocking chair, but something about him didn't seem right. His eyes, once dark, were now too deep, almost empty. The strange smile remained, but his expression was cold. The chair rocked slowly, creaking in the silence of the early morning. "Miguel," my voice came out weak, trembling. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, as if he was waiting for something. The air in the room grew heavy. A strange smell began to spread, a mixture of old wood and something else, something rotten. Suddenly, the light from the lamp flickered. For a split second, Miguel's shadow stretched out on the wall, but it wasn't his. It was bigger, twisted, and his arms were too long. My breathing quickened. What was happening there? The silence was broken by a whisper. "He doesn't sleep because he's not alone." The voice came from every corner of the room at the same time. My skin crawled. I took a step back, but my feet tripped on the carpet. I fell to the floor, my heart racing. That was when I realized the bedroom door, which I had left ajar, was now wide open. And in the hallway, something was moving. A tall, thin figure, standing in the shadows, was watching me. Miguel slowly got up from his chair, his head lolling slightly to the side. "Now you see." He smiled, but it wasn't a childish smile. It was something wrong. "He wants to play with you too." The figure in the hallway took a step inside. The light flickered once more, and then everything went dark. Darkness filled the room. My chest rose and fell rapidly, the air growing heavier and heavier. The silence was not empty. There was something there with me, something breathing along with me. A subtle rustling sounded beside me, like nails scraping against wood. My entire body froze. The light flickered for a moment, and I saw it. Miguel was standing right in front of me. His face looked wrong, distorted at an impossible angle. His skin was too pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were no longer eyes. They were just black holes, deep as an endless abyss. Behind him, the thing in the hallway was approaching. Its body was thin, bony, and it contorted in a way that defied all logic. Its arms were too long, and its thin hands had long fingers, almost like claws. "He liked you," Miguel whispered, his voice echoing, as if it were coming from several mouths at once. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I tried to move, but it was as if my body was locked in terror. And then I felt it. Something ran cold fingers over my shoulder. I screamed. The light flickered violently. The entire room seemed to vibrate, as if the house itself were alive, pulsing with something evil. Miguel began to laugh, first softly, then louder, and then other voices joined in. Low, hoarse whispered. They came from all sides. With a last burst of courage, I dragged myself across the floor to the door. But just as I reached the hallway, a huge weight fell on me. I was knocked face down. Sharp nails tore into the wood near my face. Hot, putrid breath blew against the back of my neck. "Stay," the guttural voice pleaded. I kicked, struggling, and managed to break free. I ran, stumbling down the stairs. Behind me, heavy footsteps followed me. I reached the front door and turned the knob with all my strength. It was locked. The laughter grew louder. Now it was coming from the ceiling, the walls, from inside the house. My desperation exploded. I started pounding on the door, screaming for help. And then everything stopped. The silence fell like a stone. I turned slowly, my chest heaving. The house was empty. No sign of Miguel. No shadow in the hallway. The door opened by itself behind me. The cold night air enveloped me. Without thinking twice, I ran outside. I never went back. Days later, I tried to notify the police, but they found nothing wrong in that house. Miguel's parents told me that he always slept through the night without any problems. And the strangest thing? They assured me that night, Miguel wasn't even home. I needed money. That was the only reason I had accepted the babysitting job, even though I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The offer seemed too good. Payment in advance, few responsibilities, and a polite couple who just needed someone to look after their son for a few nights. But the first night, I knew something was wrong with the house. When I arrived, I was greeted by Mrs. Vasconcellos, a pale, sunken-eyed woman who looked exhausted. Her husband, Mr. Vasconcellos, had a tense look in his eyes, almost as if he were hiding something. "The only rule," Mrs. Vasconcellos said, holding my hand tightly, "is that you don't go into his room after 11 p.m. I swallowed hard. "But what if he needs something?" I asked, feeling a strange shiver run down my spine. She hesitated, exchanging a nervous glance with her husband. Then she answered quietly, "He never needs anything." That made me uncomfortable, but I nodded. They left in a hurry, as if escaping from that house was a matter of survival. At 10:30 p.m., I took Lucas, the 7-year-old boy, to his room. He was a thin boy with big, dark eyes. He didn't say a word as he lay down. He just stared at me for long seconds before murmuring, "If you hear anything, don't open the door." A chill ran through my skin. "What do you mean by that?" But he just pulled the blanket over his face, ignoring my question. I left the room and closed the door, trying to ignore the restlessness inside me. I sat on the couch in the living room, watching TV to pass the time. The silence in the house was heavy, oppressive. Then, at 11:17 p.m., I heard it. A light scratching, coming from upstairs. My stomach turned. Maybe Lucas was awake, playing or something. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. Now it was a soft knocking. Knock, knock. I took a deep breath. I remember my parents' warning and what the boy had said, but my curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet. I reached the bedroom door. The light in the hallway flickered slightly. Another knock. Knock, knock. My hand shook as I touched the doorknob. And then a soft laugh came from inside the room. But it wasn't a child's voice. My heart almost stopped. The door was ajar, and through the small gap, I saw something that made me flinch. Lucas was sitting on the bed, motionless. But he wasn't alone. There was a shadow standing next to him. Tall, thin, twisted. And in that instant, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. My lungs seized up. The air felt thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on my chest. The shadow beside Lucas's bed was moving, but not like a normal person. Its contours swayed, as if its form were liquid, distorted by the darkness itself. Lucas remained seated, motionless. Then the shadow turned. I felt my body freeze when I saw it. It had no face, just a black void where its eyes and mouth should have been. But somehow I felt it watching me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. That's when Lucas whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Before I could react, the hallway light flickered violently, and the bedroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang, throwing me backward. I fell backward onto the hallway floor, feeling an inhuman cold spread through my body. On the other side of the door, the noises began. The scraping of nails against wood, muffled, distorted laughter, and Lucas's voice. But it wasn't just his voice anymore. There were other voices, whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls, from the ceiling, from the very air around me. Words I didn't recognize, spoken in a guttural and unnatural tone. My mind screamed for me to get out of there, but something stronger kept me still. Then silence fell. A silence so absolute that my own heartbeats seemed deafening. The doorknob began to turn slowly. I tried to get up, but my legs were shaking. The door opened just a little, enough for me to see. Lucas was still sitting on the bed, but now he was smiling. Not a normal smile. It was too wide. The corners of his mouth seemed to stretch beyond what a human face should allow. And that's when I realized the shadow was no longer beside him. It was behind me. The cold took over my body. A putrid smell like rotting meat invaded my nostrils. And then a warm breath blew against the back of my neck. You should have listened. The voice wasn't human. It was hoarse, whispered, filled with something that sounded like hunger. My legs finally reacted. I ran. I stumbled down the steps, nearly rolling down them, as a low, strange hum filled the entire house. When I reached the front door, my shaking hand turned the knob. Locked. Behind me, slow footsteps echoed down the hallway. Lucas started to laugh, and the laughter wasn't just his. My hands were sweating as I struggled to open the door. The doorknob felt as cold as ice, and no matter how hard I turned it, it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the footsteps in the hallway were slowly approaching. Knock, knock, knock. Lucas's laughter continued, growing more distorted. But it wasn't just him laughing. There was something wrong with the sound, as if many voices were laughing at once, some childish, others hoarse, guttural, and human. Then the light in the room flickered. For a split second, I saw the reflection in the glass of the door. The shadow was right behind me, tall, twisted, the hands too long, the fingers thin and sharp as razors. And at that moment, I felt it, a cold touch on my shoulder. It was as if my skin was burning from the inside out. A violent shiver ran down my spine, and my entire body went rigid. My vision went dark for a moment, and inside my mind, a voice whispered, "You're already part of this." I turned around in an impulse, despair taking over me. Lucas was no longer on the stairs, but the shadow was. It hovered there, its shape wavering like thick smoke, moving erratically. It stared at me with that emptiness where its eyes should be. And then it advanced. The world around me dissolved into darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My lungs felt empty, as if something was sucking the life out of me. I saw flashes. Lucas's room, the door opening by itself. Mrs. Vasconcellos crying in a corner. Mr. Vasconcellos mumbling something, terrified. And then I saw myself, sitting on the bed, but it wasn't me. It was something else using my face. A pale hand with long, thin fingers touched my chin in the reflection. The shadow leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Now you take care of him." The light blinked one last time, and then everything went silent. Crescent moon days later, the Vasconcellos couple returned home. They opened the door slowly, their eyes hesitant. And there I was, sitting on the couch, a calm smile on my face. "How was your night?" Mrs. Vasconcellos asked, her voice trembling. My head tilted slightly to the side. Upstairs, Lucas laughed. The house now had a new secret. and a new nanny. I knew that this would be my last night in that house. When I accepted the babysitting job, I had no idea that what would happen that night would change my life forever. It was a large, old, isolated house. It sat at the end of a deserted street, surrounded by tall trees and thick shadows. The kind of house that seemed to have secrets hidden in its walls, secrets that whispered on cold, silent nights. But what convinced me to accept it was the simple fact that the family had little demand: to look after little Pedro while they went out to an event. Mrs. Oliveira instructed me coldly. "He's used to going to bed early. Don't worry about anything. Just keep the bedroom door closed after 10 p.m. and don't come in unannounced." I smiled, trying to sound confident. But as she spoke, I noticed something in her eyes. A nervous glint, as if she were hiding something. The house had seemed strange from the start. Everything was impeccably clean, but at the same time, there was something out of place in every corner. The smell in the air was sweet, but suffocating, like a mix of dried flowers and something heavier that I couldn't identify. Pedro the boy had big eyes and a deep gaze. He didn't talk much, but his eyes seemed to follow me all the time, watching my every move with a disconcerting intensity. He was quiet, so quiet that, for a moment, I thought I was dealing with a very calm child. By 9 p.m., the house was immersed in absolute silence. The minutes passed, and the tension in the air only increased. I put him to bed, as I was instructed, and closed the door gently, although I knew I should keep it closed until dawn. At 10 p.m., I received the last message from Mrs. Oliveira. "Don't open the door under any circumstances. No matter what happens." I stood there, standing in the hallway, staring at Pedro's dark and silent room. Something in the house seemed to be waiting for me. But what gave me goosebumps weren't the footsteps or the creaking of the old woodwork. It was the fact that Pedro, even with the door closed, was no longer in the room. The silence became oppressive. Time seemed to freeze as I stared at the bedroom door. I knew he was there, but I couldn't hear a sound, not even the slightest movement. He never got out of bed. He was always so calm. I hesitated for a moment, but the feeling of discomfort made me take the first step. I opened the door, and that's when I saw Pedro was standing in the middle of the room. But he wasn't alone. Something else was there with him. Pedro stood in the middle of the room, his small figure as still as a statue. But what made me stop in my tracks was the other being beside him. It was a shadow, a dark figure that reflected no light, as if it were part of the darkness itself. It had no defined shape, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out something grotesque in its presence. It was as if it were observing the world from a different dimension, a life form that shouldn't exist. The cold in the room intensified, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. My breath became visible, floating in the icy air that enveloped the room. Pedro, with his empty, deep eyes, looked at me. There was not a single word. He didn't move. He just looked. His eyes were opaque, as if a layer of something black was covering them, obscuring his expression. Something there wasn't human. It wasn't the boy I had put in bed. I tried to speak, but my voice failed. I couldn't make a sound. Something was paralyzing me, as if the house itself was preventing me from reacting. The dark figure next to Pedro began to move slowly. Not with steps, but gliding, as if floating in the air. With each movement, the surroundings seemed to grow heavier. The air became thick, charged with an evil energy that made my skin tingle. And then the voice. "She can't see us, Pedro." The voice came from inside my head, but it wasn't mine. It was low, distorted, and seemed to resonate in my mind. It wasn't just a voice. It was as if something dark and evil was speaking directly to my soul. The feeling that something was approaching me, something that shouldn't exist, was indescribable. The cold grew even more. My teeth began to chatter, not from the temperature, but from the fear that took over every fiber of my being. I tried to retreat, but my legs were rigid, as if something invisible was keeping me in place. Suddenly, Pedro took a step forward, but not in a normal way. He floated, as if he were being pulled by the shadow. The movement was slow, but it seemed inevitable, as if he were part of something much bigger than himself. "You should have stayed away," the voice said again, clearer this time, and now it seemed to come from the dark figure. With a sudden movement, Pedro turned to face the shadow. His lips slowly parted, but it was not a human expression. The smile that formed on his face was inhuman. The corners of his mouth stretched beyond what was possible, the teeth sharp as those of a beast. And then he spoke, but not in the voice of a child. His voice was slurred, deep, distorted. "She will stay with us. She will be part of us." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and bitter. The feeling that something was about to happen enveloped me completely, but I didn't know what. The space seemed to close in around me, the sound of the house crackling, creaking as if it were falling apart. An invisible force was pushing against my back, pushing me towards the center of the room. Pedro took another step towards a figure, and I saw something that froze me completely. The room was changing. The walls began to twist, the wood stretched, the corners of the windows seemed to collapse in on themselves, as if the house were deforming before my eyes. The floor shook slightly, and I could hear something dragging itself in the shadows, something that was quickly approaching. The dark figure reached out a hand, and suddenly the bedroom door slammed shut, locking me inside that nightmare. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, but before I could scream, I felt a presence behind me. It was too late. The air was thick, filled with an unbearable pressure. The silence that filled the room was absolute, as if time had stopped. Every beat of my heart seemed to echo off the walls, and the feeling of claustrophobia grew with each passing second. I was paralyzed. My mind screamed to run, to escape, but my body didn't respond. The dark figure was behind me, its long, thin fingers touching my skin, as if trying to scratch me from the inside out. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the sensation that something non-human was touching me, penetrating me. "She's going to be ours." The hissing voice whispered directly into my ear, making my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, as if someone was suffocating me from the inside. The fear was so intense that I could barely breathe. Each word of the entity seemed to pierce my brain, ripping out pieces of my sanity. Pedro was now standing in front of me, his eyes empty and lifeless, staring at me as if I were a puppet, controlled by that evil presence. His mouth slowly opened, and the grotesque smile grew even wider, showing jagged, sharp teeth. "You will be ours, just like all the others before you." He spoke in a voice that was no longer human, a distorted voice, cold as ice. The house seemed to breathe with my presence, as if it were alive. The walls began to shake, and I could hear murmurs coming from within them, a muffled sound, as if something was moving between the spaces, waiting to break free. I looked around the room, and everything seemed to distort. The window to my left opened by itself, but what I saw outside was not what I expected. The night was pitch black, but in the sky, a faint light appeared, a strange light with colors that should not exist. Something was approaching, something that fed on the darkness itself. I felt, more than saw, the presence approaching the window, a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Suddenly, Pedro took a step forward and whispered, almost as an invitation, Come find out what happened to everyone else. You're next." The shadow spread across the house like a stain of black ink. I could no longer distinguish where what was, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring before my eyes. Then I saw the others, the distorted forms of those who had already been victims of that place. Lost souls, bodies that moved without will, empty eyes that looked at me with an expression of eternal despair. It was too late to leave. When I tried to move, I felt a cold hand grip my arm tightly. The sensation was as if I was being pulled into an abyss, as if my body was being taken to a place where the light would never reach. It was at that moment that I realized the house was not just a house. It was a prison, a trap built to imprison those who dared to enter. And Pedro was not a child. He never was. He was part of it, a puppet controlled by the darkness. With a silent scream, I was dragged into the darkness. The last thing I saw was Pedro's smile distorting, and then emptiness. "What about you? Are you going to stay to see what happens the next night?" If you were as creeped out as I was, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment below what you think happened to the nanny. What did the house want from her? Leave your comment, share the story, and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories.